Isan from MMADK. I am here today with Brian D'Souza. He is a journalist with us from Toronto, Canada. And there was a special incident with Brian D'Souza lately. UFC had a world tour, UFC 189 world tour around the world for 12 days, and they went to Canada eventually on March 27th. And they had a press conference over there. And Brian, I will try to read your question. So at first, so I will quote you. Your question to Dana White was, your question to Jose Aldo, the champion, was, I wonder how you feel about the pay situation. Do you think it has improved at all? How does the lawsuit affect your contract with the UFC? Do you have any thoughts about joining the lawsuit by Rob Macy? When you asked Jose Aldo that question, his translator started to translate, and then when he was finished, Dana White, the UFC president, responded by saying, he said you're a dick, and he also said, quote unquote, just translating for him. And then it was you getting up saying that was a respectful question, and your answer was disrespectful. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's completely correct.
Hmm. Can you tell us about the aftermath? So this happened, the press conference was over. What happened after that?
Well, initially there was maybe supposed to be a scrum with Dana and a few reporters, but maybe they decided this beforehand. They handpicked two reporters for Dana to talk to. There was no further contact between the UFC PR staff and me at that time. No one came up to me and talked to me or chastised me, and so I left that area. Um, And then later on, I talked to my editor from Bloody Elbow. He decided to kill my stories. He wasn't pleased, as you can imagine. And the next day, I began seeing some rumors appearing that I didn't write for Bloody Elbow or I lied on my credential application was actually something I saw online. And I emailed the UFC PR rep and I explained to her that I write for these two publications, but I wanted to post something on this Saturday, the day right after the press conference from Bloody Elbow. And then later on, I did an interview, and then Dana probably got inflamed and said I wasn't a journalist. I snuck into the press conference, etc. But again, on this Saturday, the UFC PR rep, when we talked, she said, you can't come to any more media events because of my behavior. And so that was the main fallout.
Was that the only explanation? Was that your behavior was the reason you can't come to any press conferences in the future?
I didn't really probe because what I told the UFC PR rep was if you weren't getting a paycheck from the UFC and you were looking at this impartially, you would have a different viewpoint, right? But they didn't say you're banned because you asked Dana White about you asked Jose Aldo about fighter pay or the lawsuit. That was never said.
So how come you had a deal with Bloody Elbow in the beginning, and then afterwards they killed your two articles?
Can't really talk too much about that because it would just be speculation on my part. I was told certain things from the UFC, and I was told certain things from my editor, and I saw some stuff written online. And, in the wake of Dana White's comments, which were completely, not factual at all, I don't want to add any flames to it. I don't want anyone to attack Bloody Elbow or to misconstrue the relationship between the UFC and Bloody Elbow. But there was another Bloody Elbow reporter there, and so one explanation could be given is he was supposed to report on the press conference. That's just one theory.
Okay. So recently, Vanderlei Silva, he had an interview with I saw it on MMAfighting.com. I think it was with Guilherme Cruz, and he said something about you getting fired after that incident. Is that correct?
No, that's a he's kind of misconstrued facts. Vanderlei said a number of things. I'm a freelancer, so technically I'm not an employee of Bloody Elbow, so I couldn't be fired. But I think the spirit of what he meant was that my gig didn't come off the way it should have, it's probably not going to be a consistent thing. I don't know if I'll ever write for them again. So there is some truth there, but Vanderlei doesn't have the whole story.
Okay. So what do you say to those maybe critics? So UFC has a lot of fans and maybe some journalists as well that say that okay, maybe it wasn't the right time to ask Jose Aldo that question. What is your explanation as to why you asked that question at that certain point of time?
Good question. I really was curious about. I read this article where he's complaining about his fighter pay to Mark Raimondi of Fox Sports, and I didn't want to ask the same question. Initially, I was thinking of asking, "Do you feel disrespected in comparison to Conor McGregor, who's saying he's making $7 million?" So at that moment, I was thinking about going a different way. And, I've just been curious from the start about, what main event fighters thought of the lawsuit. I heard the story that some were contemplating joining, and then the UFC would renegotiate their contracts. I was more looking to see what his answer would be. I didn't expect him to reply directly, "This is what I make," or, something controversial, but I thought there would be some kind of reaction, or he would give some kind of statement that would lead me towards the truth.
Were you surprised by his answer at the press conference?
Jose Aldo's or Dana White's?
Jose Aldo's answer.
No, I thought it was a pretty good way of saying no comment. He didn't condemn the people suing the UFC, and he didn't endorse them. He did actually reveal like some of his personal feelings. And I've had dealings with a lot of fighters. I've had a lot of private one-on-ones, like behind the scenes. That's where I get most of my information from. So I do know how to talk to guys one-on-one. And what you see them say in the public and what they say behind the scenes are two completely different things. That's really important that I want to make clear. I met Jose Aldo before in Rio de Janeiro, and I met a lot of fighters when I went to Brazil. And what they think and say about Dana White and the UFC is really different than what you read in interviews. Okay.
So what do you actually feel? Do you think he's satisfied with what he's getting paid right now?
No, Jose Aldo is well aware, as many fighters are, many UFC fighters, that their salaries and their rights fall well below their true market value.
Hmm. So you think like the fighter pay issue isn't the fighter pay issue is a big deal right now. They're not getting paid what they deserve.
Correct. What makes it an issue? It's always been an issue, probably since the beginning. But since BJ, we could read BJ's pen book from a few years ago. He always knew right from his first contract with the UFC years ago that he was getting an unfair amount. What's really changed now is fighters have a little bit more information. They have some more tools to compare. I did this number of pay-per-view buys and I got this amount of money, whereas a professional boxer got this amount. So what's changed is the fighter's own perception of what's going on, and they want to see change, and they believe they deserve more, and they're reaching out for a mechanism or a way to get it.
What have you received like in terms of feedback from fans and whatnot? Is it mostly positive or negative?
I would say it's a mixed bag, and there are people supporting me for the wrong reasons. I don't want this to be about me and Dana White. I didn't insult him or start like an argument with him. I'm very much about sticking it to the issues. I didn't do this to stick it to Dana White. That's something I really think should be made clear. My point has always been about journalism, about having this access to these financial numbers, the right to ask a question about salaries and stuff, and seeing legitimate coverage of the lawsuit. I've seen a lot of biased slants on it, um, because there's a lot of dissatisfaction among UFC fighters. That's why there's a lawsuit. So people are supporting me, and some people, I have my detractors, but I also have heard some legitimate criticism from a few quarters, and believe me, I'm listening to it. So I would say 80 to 90% positive comments, and some people were directed to me by Dana White, and they don't know my side of the story. They're just making comments, and nothing I say is going to change how they think or feel.
Mm. So you say you have received some criticism as well that you have reflected upon. What kind of criticism is that?
There's a couple people in the MMA media who said I was too hard on MMA right media and journalists, and that I accused too many people of nefarious contact with the UFC. So I had to reflect on that, and my conclusion is, because of the articles I wrote, the series called Shill 'Em All, which describes links between the UFC and journalists, and they believe I went too far. And looking back, I realize how someone like Ariel Helwani could feel insulted by what I wrote, or a couple other guys who feel that I unfairly painted them as shills, right? A shill as in someone who works for the UFC but masquerades as a reporter. And that's something I'm really keen to address.
Mm. So do you think the MMA media has a problem right now in terms of the free press, or do you think that it just needs some small adjustments here and there?
What's great question, okay? If this is the truth. The financial issues I'm talking about are linked directly to the amount of freedom the MMA media has. The media is controlled in a sense, or is offered disincentives like barring their credentials for certain guys or financial incentives. Those are ways to try and control the storyline or the narrative about fighter pay. So what I would just like to see happen is that people would understand how these two issues are linked. Um, and is it a small issue or a big issue? What makes it a big issue is the lack of discussion about what I'm talking about. There was a reporter named Jonathan Snowden. He's very well known. He's written several books. He's a Bleacher Reporter writer right now. And he had his credentials barred after UFC 177 because he didn't write a positive article telling people to run out and buy 177. And I haven't seen anyone cover his story or talk about Jonathan Snowden. So my question for the MMA media is, why don't you support one of your own? Why don't you stand up behind this guy until you can get him credentialed again? I'm not saying to try and attack the UFC, but until you can get respect for yourselves, people will always accuse you of being shills or being biased.
Yeah, because that is the exact same thing we see with fighters sometimes when you talk about fighter unions and whatnot. A lot of journalists actually say, well, why don't they stand up for each other, right? So why do you think that when I tried to look you up and find some stories about the recent incident with you and with you at the press conference, there wasn't a whole lot. So are you wondering, like, where are the major outlets? Why don't they want to like ask me some questions, or why aren't you on the MMA Hour? That's what I'm thinking. This should be a big story.
It's a great question. The number one reason is Dana made a terrible mistake. He insulted somebody, whether that was me or somebody else, just like Loretta Hunt. He insulted somebody in a very public arena. And the layman, the average person, the casual fan, your mother, your uncle, if they saw what happened, they wouldn't understand Dana White's reaction. There is no plausible reason why he would be able to turn around and insult me and get angry over a journalist asking a question to the layman. And so he wants to contain this, and he wants this hushed up so it can move on. And also, he got caught lying. So the more coverage MMA media gives this, the more dangerous it is to the UFC. So Ariel Helwani does not want me on his show standing up for myself or even answering his questions, which are easily verified and answered. Like, I have all the evidence on my side. Now, he has a couple points of criticism which I take and I accept, but there's no interest in continuing this narrative. The narrative everyone wants is Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo by the pay-per-view. That's the story the UFC wanted to get out of this.
Mm. Have you talked to Ariel Hawani?
No, I thought about emailing him, but I've emailed him in the past. I've met him a couple of times in real life, and which he was alluding to in that rant, but we haven't talked since his rant.
Mm. Do you see some legitimate? Can you name some legitimate journalists out there that we can, the small outlets can look up to and say that they're doing a great job?
One guy who's Jonathan Snowden, of course. I really like his stuff. Another guy who's kind of interesting is Chuck Mindenhall. He did the piece on Jason Thacker of The Ultimate Fighter. I am preferential to Hall because he writes about financial issues and contract issues in his major stories. For instance, he mentioned Jason Thacker's contractual rights were tied up for a year after he fought Chris Levin in the UFC. He
Mm.
also had some interesting info about Monty Cox when he did a long piece about Robbie Lawler, like a real long form piece. So he's kind of smart and good that way. But I've always set the benchmark as boxing journalists, like the great ones, the legendary guys. And I always felt that MMA media and MMA writers fell short of that ideal.
Mm. In an article I read with you, I think it was an Australian MMA outlet. I'm not quite sure. You said something about the difference between journalism and opportunism. Can you please talk about that?
Yeah, that was for MMA Canvas. Um, what I meant by that is there are those who are going to look at what happened and see it as an attack on free press, on journalism, and opportunism, as in, or careerism might be another word. What did I hurt other people's careers with this? I probably did. Okay, and by that I mean, Dana's lashing out against Bloody Elbow, or he could pull the credentials completely from certain websites. So because I didn't uphold the status quo, and there could be repercussions, so it's a loss of opportunity for certain people, and it's also an opportunity for people who don't like me to criticize me, which is what Ariel did, right? Um, so the journalists who understand that if this happened to me, it could happen to them, understand what journalism is, whereas others were more protective of their careers, maybe rightfully so. The Dana is not really nice to people who go up against him.
So which way is the right way to go? Let's just say we have a new journalist out there who's trying to make a name for himself. So can you even like find a way to satisfy both parties to have your own integrity and journalism in place and still be able to cover the sport as it should be?
It's a dangerous game. What I was told was you have to fight on the periphery, so you have to pick really small issues that aren't in the limelight, and you can never go head to head and be that too confrontational. So it's possible to have a guerrilla campaign of journalism, which is kind of what I was doing for a little while. With articles, even Shillamall got some major attention, but I didn't change anything, right? No one read Shillamall and the UFC had to give Josh Gross's credentials back. If anything, things are actually worse now that Jonathan Snowden is out. So the only way to really change things is to make this a bigger issue and keep applying pressure from our end. What I think is right now to work in the MMA media, you must make small compromises. You must consistently make small compromises. And yes, you can have some pushback, but it has to happen at the right place and time. And Jonathan Snowden's a perfect example of a guy who was consistently smart with how he pushed back and reported on issues. Luke Thomas is another guy, a great guy for that. He constantly digs up salary info. Luke Thomas understands the difference. Luke Thomas is from MMA Fighting. He understands the difference between a fighters association and a fighters union. So he's a good example of somebody who works in the industry, also works for Spike TV, and so I believe you can have it both ways, but don't be too confrontational.
Do you see that happening right now with more and more journalists coming up and trying to be trying to make a difference in MMA media?
Yes, I've had a number of people come to me and talk to me, and I've read a number of articles where a couple guys get it, like the MMA rankings affecting their Reebok sponsorships. Even a guy like Kevin Iole went up to Dana White one day and asked him about the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. And I'll take a small amount of credit for that. Um, but so I am seeing more of a pushback. But is it a decisive blow? That hasn't happened yet, and we aren't at the point where when the UFC gives Josh Gross credentials back, then our journalism is won. Then we know we're okay and we're in the clear.
Mm.
But it's happening at a slow rate. But then again, it's always been happening like that. And then the UFC comes back and clamps down or kicks somebody's ass, and then things go back to the status quo, right?
Mm. do you see the same issue in regards to fighters and promote fighters and trainers and whatnot? Are you able uh, to be a little bit critical towards them, or is that not a good idea as well?
Great question. I had a long-term, like years-long animosity with George St. Pierre's manager, Sherry Spencer, from the first time I met her till George got rid of her. And she would constantly put pressure on me to control my coverage about the UFC and about George. And there were always threats that I wouldn't be allowed to interview him if I didn't play ball. Well, not exactly that. I mean, it was more intoned. Um, like, do you know what I mean? Like, she wouldn't let me interview George at certain times when I wanted to talk to him for my book, stuff like that. And certain trainers too, yes. But the reason trainers and managers are afraid is because they're afraid of the UFC normally. They're scared that if their fighter says something critical or they say something critical, they'll be pushed back to them. They're not in a good position either. They have to do whatever they're told or whatever the UFC says happens, right? They don't have another option or way to go most of the time.
Hmm. So we yeah. So where do you see the sport like or the MMA media 10 years from now? Do you see it as something different, something better, or do you think it's going to be quite the same?
That's a good question. One of the reasons I was critical of someone in the MMA media is because they said, in 10 or 20 years or in time, things will change for the better. And I thought this person dramatically misread the situation. Things change because people change them, because people stand up and say, hey, you know what? This is wrong. That's how blacks in America achieved civil rights. That's how feminism took off. That's how you win a war like World War II. People come up with a plan of action, and they start enforcing it. The one thing that could change things right now is the antitrust lawsuit led by Rob Macy, or maybe if the fighters formed an association, which is possible. But the tough thing right now is that people, MMA media members themselves, don't even know what an association is. In the simplest definition, if enough fighters got together and said, "Hey, we don't like the Reebok deal, okay? We want whoever we want to sponsor us, and we're not going to fight unless we have that right to our own sponsorship." That would be an association. There's no union dues. There's no pooling of the money made from fights and splitting it up like in communism. Um, I just want to see that idea come across and explained, right? So, will things change in 10 years? I'm going to say they will because we got the lawsuit, which is like, who knows what's going to happen there? And there's Bellator, so there's some competition. So, there's the potential for change, but not much. Things have not changed at all in the 5 or 10 years that I've been around witnessing the UFC operate.
You obviously have written for some major outlets like ESPN and Fox Sports and whatnot, but do you want your press credentials back at some point, or do you even care, or where do you stand right now?
Uh, all right, this is gonna sound pretty bad, but I'm self-interested just like everybody else. I wanted to go to see the big fighters and like guys like George St. Pierre or Anderson Silva or Fedor Emelianenko. But since they're gone, there's no and they're not at the same level, right? They were. There's no incentive for me to even care about my credentials, right? I, I I'm not really. I don't have that emotional investment in the UFC and in the fights. And the only thing I care about is like find out what the result is at this point. Like, did Crow Cop beat Gonzaga? That's what I want to know. Um, I'm interested in maybe doing another book, a second MMA book at some point in my career, but I already have enough material for my own journeys and stuff. So I'm mildly curious about getting my credentials back, but there's nothing in it for me, right?
Mm. So just this last question, we talked about Vanderlei Silva earlier, and he talks a lot about the stuff like this, about the rights of the fighters and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think
Do you think that
Vanderlei.
makes a difference?
Yes, 100%. Vanderlei's a guy with a lot of visibility, and he could make a headline, right? There's two guys, Tito Ortiz and Quentin Rampage Jackson, who are both at Bellator now. They used to complain about the UFC all the time, and But I wasn't really happy because their complaints rarely focused on an issue that would change the status quo. They didn't have a long-term strategy that would change the industry. They were really self-interested, and when they spoke up, it was always about them. And I like Vanderlei. He's a legendary fighter, but he's speaking out because he's outside the industry right now. He has some static or some problems with the UFC. I think he's always been upset about the video game never being paid. UFC fighters got like checks for like a few $1,000s or nothing to give away their likeness rights for a lifetime. So maybe he was always upset about that, and now because he's on the outs, he has the opportunity to talk about that. I'm glad he talked about my situation to bring some visibility to it. Um, so I mean, that's a pretty helpful thing. On the other hand, he has to have a long-term strategy too. So he should join the lawsuit is what a couple people have been saying, and why he doesn't or why he's not talking about, because that's an actual mechanism to change the industry, right? Or he should actually be the guy who reads up about what an association is and try to recruit everybody else into it. So those are the things that are going to change things.
Okay, Brian, thank you for the interview. I advise people to. I haven't read it myself, but I've seen some videos about your book, which is called Pound for Pound, and people can go and read your book. And I have a plan for myself to go and buy your book and read it very, very soon. It looks very interesting. But thank you so much for the interview, Brian, and all the best from here.
Thank you for having me.